All right, let's go ahead and kick it off. Bill, good to have you with us here from Alger. And I will go ahead and begin the webcast here, tell you a little bit more about the Stewardship Network. As I said, I'm Lisa with the Stewardship Network, and wonderful to be with you all. And good, Nicole, I'm glad you're musing on future presentations. If you don't know about the Stewardship Network, we are a 501c3 national and international award-winning organization with a more than 20-year history. We have our geographically place-based member communities across the Great Lakes and beyond on the East Coast and the West Coast. And so I encourage you to learn more about our member communities program. For those of you who are part of our ongoing monthly Stewardship Networks, you know that these happen each and every second Wednesday of the month. You can go to our website and sign up for future webcasts, but you can put it in your calendar during the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour on the second Wednesday and just see if you are interested in attending. Our mission is to connect, equip, and mobilize people and organizations to care for land and water. We connect you all in so many ways, and we love doing that by sharing the knowledge that we're going to hear from Bill today about Kirtland's warblers, and we share that as widely as possible for our member communities and from our member communities. We equip, we really want to remove all the hurdles that you all have and keep you outside doing the work to steward the land and water in your community so that you can pour thousands of hours into your local ecosystems. We mobilize our member communities and make collaborative ecological stewardship as accessible to everyone as we possibly can. And lately, we have been super busy. So we connect in all kinds of different ways. Nicole, who's thinking about musing on different topics, John, who's part of Ball State University, and Sherry from the field station in Muncie, Indiana. We have now launched our official conference website that will be happening in January 2025. It will be our 18th conference. It's happening on January 23rd and 24th in 2025. So I say it's super easy to remember it. It's 23, 24, and 2025. So if you're ever wondering when the Stewardship Network Conference is in 2025, remember 23, 24, 25. We'll be back at Kellogg Center in East Lansing, Michigan. It's our chance to learn, connect, and replenish. We encourage you to go and explore the new website. Our keynotes are up there. Learn about the logistics and sponsorship opportunities. We have a student scholarship fund that people are contributing to now, where you can donate or apply to that on the website. Our early bird pricing is available right now, so I encourage you all to register. Folks are doing that already. And are you all online? Some of you presenters at the next conference, submit your abstract for a presentation at this year's conference and help make it another amazing event. You all who present receive a discounted admission. And the deadline for that, we're in kind of the final weeks of that, is October 1st. So encourage you all to spread the word about presentations. One of the things that I think about is this is our chance each and every month. The webcast is kind of a tiny drip of the conference, but this is our chance to share the great work that you all do with each other and learn from each other. So October 1st is the deadline for that. Again, we equip in so many different ways. Our Gloves for Good program has distributed more than 35,000 pairs of clean, lightly used work gloves all across the US and beyond. Encourage you all to learn a little bit more about the Gloves for Good program. If you don't know, we have diverted over 2,600 pounds of waste from landfills. We have saved 3.3 metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions, and more than $55,000 have been saved for our partners who receive these free gloves for the stewardship work that they do. Learn about it. Go to stewardshipnetwork.org/gloves. Make your own order. If you haven't heard about the program, go check it out. You can order in all kinds of different increments. We mobilize. We help people receive funding. We just received word that the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation awarded us over $1 million for one of our newest member communities, the Greater Baltimore Wilderness Coalition, where they will be supporting water quality improvement, habitat restoration, and community stewardship efforts in the Chesapeake Bay. Super excited to be working with the great folks in Greater Baltimore Wilderness Coalition on this project. And we'll always be there to help and support with all kinds of logistics of this kind of funding and dispersing the money across this member community in this case, but also working with you all to do that as well. I am super pleased to be here today with Bill Rapai of the Kirtland's Warblers Alliance to talk about rethinking Kirtland's warbler conservation, a super interesting conservation-dependent species. And Bill, thank you so much for joining us. As I said, please make liberal use of the chat or the Q&A wherever you want to drop it. We'll look forward. I'll keep track of your questions and comments as they come up, and look forward to dropping them in. Again, Bill, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully we had a little issue earlier. Let's hope that we've gotten past that. Hopefully you can see that properly.
Looking great, Bill.
Good, very good. Thank you very much once again for inviting me. My name is Bill Rapai. I'm the executive director of the Kirtland's Warbler Alliance. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a forester. I'm a former newspaper guy. I was an editor for the Detroit Free Press and the Boston Globe for a while. I'm a birder. I'm heading for Portugal next month to attend a birding festival in southern Portugal. I'm the author of 3 books. The first one being The Kirtland's Warbler, the story of the bird's fight against extinction and the people who saved it, which is what got me sucked into Kirtland's Warbler conservation. After writing this book, I was saying goodbye and thank you to the people at or at least I thought I was saying goodbye and thank you to the people at the Kirtland's Warbler recovery team meeting. And one of the people who I met along the way said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Well, my work here's done. I'm going to, go to work on another book." He said, "No, you're not." He said, "The Jack Pine has a way of calling you back." And yeah, I've kind of been sucked into Kirtland's Warbler conservation ever since. But I will say that, it sounds cliche, but yeah, my experience is that me as one person, not being a biologist, not being a forester, I am making a difference, I think, in Kirtland's Warbler conservation. So what does the Kirtland's Warbler Alliance do? Well, we were created to help support the conservation of the Kirtland's Warbler, of course, but we do advocacy with organizations and individuals. We spend a lot of time in Lansing, talking to state legislators, helping them understand the issues involved in Kirtland's Warbler conservation. Some legislators, believe it or not, have trouble wrapping their minds around why a bird that is no longer on the endangered species list still requires conservation as far as we can see into the future. So we have to explain that time and time again. We help with the Kirtland's Warbler census, which is coming up next year. I'll talk a little bit about that in a little while. And of course, we act as a watchdog. One of the things we'll talk about today is the shortage that the Kirtland's Warbler is facing in habitat right now. And we've been following that, and we were the ones who really forcefully raised that issue that got things turned around and moving in the right direction again. So on today's agenda, we'll get started with some Kirtland's Warbler 101. I know that all of you are familiar with the bird, but I'll provide a little context and background to explain how we overcame some past challenges to get where we are today. Then I'll take a look at some new challenges that we're facing. Then we'll take a look at some of the new research that is being conducted, both in creating experimental habitat and in KW survivability, and how the birds move around and use the landscape. Depending on what we learn from that new experimentation, we may, again, do some significant rethinking of how we perform Kirtland's Warbler conservation. Yeah, the discussion on experimental habitat that's happening right now will lead us into the $64,000 question, and that is, will the use of fire be making a comeback on Kirtland's Warbler conservation land? And finally, we'll look at the involvement of a new partner in management, Native American tribes, which we are all very excited about. I just want to say that this is going to be a very broad view of the issues we face in Kirtland's Warbler conservation. Take my word for it, I could really go down some rabbit holes. So consider yourself spared. I'm guessing that many of you already know, oops, I've jumped ahead 2 slides. Forgive me. Before we go any further, I just want to say that I had a conversation a couple of years ago with Phil Huber of the U.S. Forest Service. He is one of the experts on Kirtland's Warbler conservation. And I asked, Phil, years ago, the eagle came off the endangered species list. The peregrine falcon came off the endangered species list, and it was like we could just wash our hands and walk away. What's the difference with the Kirtland's warbler? And his response was, with Kirtland's warbler conservation, nothing is ever simple. Yeah, it's absolutely the case. And as we go through today's conversation, I think you'll understand why I say that, because there are immense challenges, and we need to keep explaining to the public why, once again, a bird that is no longer on the endangered species list needs to have all this continuing conservation work. It's expensive, it's ongoing, and it complicates things. I'm guessing that many of you already know much about this, but I'll go through the next couple of slides just to make sure that we're all on the same page. We have a same basic understanding of Kirtland's warbler biology and life cycle. The summer/breeding range of the Kirtland's warbler stretches from Wisconsin on the west to Ontario on the east, with about 95% of the population breeding in that yellow area that you see on the map in the northern Lower Peninsula. Although the warbler has been recorded breeding in eastern Ontario since the second decade of the 20th century, it has expanded its breeding range west into Wisconsin only in the past 20 years or so. As much as we love the Kirtland's warbler here in Michigan and consider it to be our bird, the conservation team really wants to share the wealth. We want to see more Kirtland's warblers breeding outside that core breeding range. Why? Why is this important? Because one, it's a hedge against climate change. If something happens in that core breeding area, things begin to change. We've got more birds across the landscape. It gives us a better chance of recovering the species. And the same thing would be true if there was some kind of catastrophic event in that core breeding area. If there are more birds spread across the landscape, we have a much better chance of recovering the species. The Kirtland's warbler nests on the ground, which is why it needs sandy, quick draining soil. It loves dense jack pine trees that are between 5 and 20 years old. It'll kind of abandon them beginning around 15, but still use some stands that are about 20. Once the trees get into their late teens, they begin to lose their lower branches, and the warblers abandon the stands because they no longer have that cover that's provided by the lower branches. There are, believe it or not, some significant sex differences in habitat. Males will set up a territory wherever they can find a spot in appropriate habitat. Females, on the other hand, much prefer areas that were created by wildfire over areas that were created by plantation. One thing I want to point out about this photo is that I took this photo back in 2011 when I was in the field with Sarah Rockwell and her team doing research on Kirtland's warbler. And I want you to notice how Sarah's dressed. She's got a winter hat on and a heavy jacket. This was on the morning of July 6th. The temperature that morning was in the low 40s when we hit the field. And that just gives you an idea of how extreme this habitat is. It really is an amazing ecosystem that's sort of off by itself with very few influences from Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. The non-breeding range is primarily in the central islands of the Bahama Islands. Why these islands? Because, believe it or not, in the winter, the warbler prefers coppice habitat over the pine-dominated islands of the northern Bahamas. We've got pines in Michigan, but it doesn't care for the pines in the northern islands of the Bahamas. It prefers coppice habitat. Coppice provides the white sage, the wild sage and white torchberries that the warblers thrive on during the winter. Even though the warbler prefers the central Bahamas, it certainly can be found elsewhere. In recent years, individuals have been found in Cuba and Jamaica during the winter. There is a historical report of one being found in the Yucatan Peninsula. That report was poo-pooed for many, many years prior to the individual being documented in Jamaica. Now people are looking at that report of the Kirtland's warbler in the Yucatan as being a credible report. I'm certain that some of you are also looking at the map and saying, uh-oh, those islands are pretty low and if the Atlantic continues to rise as a result of climate change, many of those islands will be submerged. Yeah, it's a major concern, and we hope that the warbler will adapt to the changes as they occur. There's not a whole lot we can really do about it. I'm also willing to bet some of you looked at that last slide and said, why does that stupid little bird go to the Bahamas where it can be wiped out by a hurricane? Well, one good reason. Hurricanes actually create new habitat for the birds by blowing down the tall trees that would otherwise shade out the fruit-producing plants that the warbler loves to eat. One other thing about the warbler, it's a late migrant. In general, Kirtland's warbler concert migration begins in late September, and the bulk of the population is gone about the first week of October or so. Notice how that migration actually coincides with the peak of the Atlantic hurricane season. The peak of the Atlantic hurricane season comes around September 10th, so the birds decide that they're going to leave after the peak of the Atlantic hurricane season. Count me, I don't know how they know that that's the case when they should move, but they do, and count me as impressed. Some people wonder why it's named Kirtland's Warbler. Well, it's named after Jared P. Kirtland, who didn't really discover the warbler, but there's a little story behind it. The first person who actually took a warbler was a bird collector who shot a Kirtland's warbler, a man by the name of Lodge, who shot a Kirtland's warbler in the 1800s in the Bahamas. But he didn't do anything with his specimen. He didn't try to identify it. A young man by the name of Charles Pease, who was a bird collector, shot a bird on his father-in-law's farm west of Cleveland in the 1850s. He compared it to all the other birds in his collection, and he didn't know what it was. He couldn't identify it. So he gave it to his father-in-law, Dr. Jared P. Kirtland. Dr. Kirtland, by all accounts, was an extraordinary man. He was in the first graduating class of Yale Medical School. He was a biologist, a botanist. He used his knowledge to help the farmers in Northern Ohio to improve the yield of their crops. He was a member of the Ohio legislature, and he focused on prison reform in Ohio. He was on a committee to improve the quality of drinking water in Northern Ohio. He was on the committee that helped establish the Cleveland Mystery of Natural History. He was an abolitionist. His house was on the Underground Railroad. There are two species named after him, three species named after him, a snake and a clam besides the bird. So he compared this specimen that was given to him by his son-in-law, and he couldn't identify the specimen either, but he knew what to do with it, and that was to give it to Spencer Baird, who happened to be traveling through Cleveland. Spencer Baird was the secretary of the Smithsonian. Baird took it back to the Smithsonian and compared it to all the other species in the Smithsonian, and he realized that this was a new species. This was something different. So the following year, he wrote a paper describing the species, and he named it after Kirtland. So how did we get to where we are today? Well, we really don't have a really good grasp on Kirtland's warbler breeding range beyond about 120 years or so. But we do suspect that there have been a few population booms and busts along the way, and there probably haven't been that many birds in the population ever, because the breeding is so closely tied to available habitat. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, northern Michigan was essentially stripped of the pine trees, but that opened up vast new areas for young jack pines to grow, and we suspect at that point that there was a real boom in Kirtland's warbler population. As the young jack pines matured, we did our best to squelch fire because we had seen the ghastly toll that it had taken over the previous century. And as the trees matured, there were fewer and fewer areas of young jack pines for the Kirtland's warbler to nest in, so the numbers began to decline. Then came the brown-headed cowbird. The 1-2 punch of lack of habitat and the cowbird pushed the population of the Kirtland's warbler to the brink. The 1971 census found a significant downturn in the population, and that was enough to get the state and the federal agencies responsible for conservation to meet in Ann Arbor to write a conservation plan. And number one goal of that conservation plan was to hit the cowbird hard. That's when cowbird trapping began. Their effort was supported and reinforced by the passage of the Endangered Species Act in 1972, and the Kirtland's warbler was immediately listed and a recovery team formed. The recovery team set about creating a plan with firm goals and methods for accountability. The population remained steady for about the next 10 years or so. Then on May 5th, 1980, the U.S. Forest Service set a prescribed fire south of Mayo, Michigan, to create new habitat for the Kirtland's warbler. During the fire, this was on an area that had already been cut, and they were simply burning off slash, the stuff that had been left behind, the trunks, the branches, etc. So there wasn't all that much material there that could burn. It's not like it was a stand of mature trees. But during that fire, the wind picked up and it blew out of control. It jumped M33. It burned through the town of Mack Lake, destroying 44 structures, and in the process, it killed one young Forest Service worker. In total, the fire ran for 4 miles, and it destroyed about 25,000 acres. It was an absolute disaster for the Forest Service. People in the area simply could not believe that the government would burn them out of their homes for a bird. And public sentiment in the area turned against the agencies and the warbler. There was a whole lot of anger. There were signs up in stores, kill the Kirtland's warbler. I met a gentleman who lived through the Mack Lake fire, and he still referred to it in 2010 when I was talking to him. He raised his fist and he said, "That damn bird." He was still very angry about it. Yeah, the Mack Lake fire was an absolute preventable tragedy, but it also presented biologists and foresters with an opportunity to study how the Kirtland's warbler would respond to a catastrophic landscape scale fire. The biologists quickly learned that even though they were creating vast areas of jack pine plantations, densely packed jack pine plantations, the Kirtland's warbler preferred the landscape created by the fire. That landscape turned out to be much more of a mosaic than the monoculture of the plantations. The landscape had left behind some pockets of live trees that were unburned. There were open spots. There were spots where trees regenerated in dense pockets. And there were old tall trees left behind that provided snags for the Kirtland's warblers to sit and sing on. And this randomness became the model for planting plantations into the future. They incorporated that randomness into the plantations that really became the secret sauce for Kirtland's warbler conservation going forward. And you can see how the Kirtland's warbler population responded on the population chart here once the habitat from the Mack Lake fire really kicked in right about 1990, and it was an upward trend from there. From there, the rest is history. The Mack Lake fire led directly to the population growth that resulted in the Kirtland's warbler being removed from the Endangered Species List in 2019. With that delisting, we had the luxury, an absolute luxury, of being able to reconsider how Kirtland's warbler conservation gets done. We had hit on the secret sauce that kept the Kirtland's warbler from going extinct. But a whole set of questions, new questions, had built up over the previous decades. Were we doing the Kirtland's warbler conservation right? Was there really a better way that we could do it? Could it be done more efficiently? Could it be done at a reduced cost to taxpayers? And perhaps most importantly, could we find a way to make it cost neutral? Without the Endangered Species Act, it's pretty likely that we would have lost a whole lot of North America flora and fauna. But there's a flaw with the Endangered Species Act. About 80% of the species that are on the list today are conservation reliant, like the Kirtland's warbler. They depend on the protection and conservation efforts of the federal government now and for as far as we can see into the future. And if conservation efforts need to continue for the Kirtland's warbler as far as we can see in the future, but the Kirtland's warbler has been removed from the endangered species list, which means there's no longer any funding coming in, endangered species funding coming in from Washington. And that is a problem. It costs about $500,000 a year to plant for Kirtland's warbler habitat. And so how do we pay for that conservation work if those dollars are no longer coming in? And it's not just about the trees getting in the ground, it's also about cowbird trapping and research. The solution is to establish a long-term fund, which is a new challenge that we'll talk a lot about in a little bit. But we are facing major new challenges. The delisting of the Kirtland's warbler in 2019 gave the Kirtland's warbler conservation team an opportunity to rethink what we do and how we do it. The 1976 conservation plan said the species would be considered fully recovered at 1,000 pairs. Well, we met that number and we blew right past it. That gave the Forest Service and the DNR the ability to begin to focus on some of the other endangered and threatened species in the state. And unfortunately, when they began to do that, they began to lose their focus on the Kirtland's warbler. And we quickly began to fall behind on our habitat goals in the core breeding areas of the northern Lower Peninsula. This is unfortunately one of the problems with bureaucracies that deal with wildlife conservation. The largest focus often gets put on the most important issue that's in front of them. And, it's not just government bureaucracies that we're talking about here. We're also talking about organizations like the ones that many of us belong to. We tend to give the most attention to the most important thing. Anyway, you can see by this chart that the number of acres planted annually has fallen, and we've fallen well behind our goal of planting 3,830 acres per year that was set in the 2014 conservation plan. I'm going to throw in a parenthetical statement here. The agencies are reworking that number now on how many acres it takes to support a pair of breeding Kirtland's warblers in the northern Lower Peninsula. So the next conservation plan that comes out, those numbers might be a little bit different. So we'll just have to wait to see how it shakes out. But yeah, we've fallen way behind in the number of acres that we need for the Kirtland's warbler. So this chart gives you an idea of just how far we are behind currently. The goal is to have about 36,000 acres of habitat available at all times. We're at about 22,000 acres now, and we're going to bottom out at about 20,000 acres in 2027 before we can actually reverse this trend. As I said, part of it is the agencies taking their eye off the ball, but part of it is the decline in the jack pine market. Jack pine is considered to be a junk tree. Go to your local lumberyard and find a really good quality 2x4. That's likely to be red pine. If you look at the next bin over, the budget 2x4, that's only 99%. It's all gnarly and bent. It's likely jack pine. Jack pine can be used to make chipboard, mulch, wood pellets for heating, but beyond that, not much. Therefore, the Kirtland's warbler conservation is done at a loss, and that has led the Kirtland's warbler to live on the public dole. The goal for the agencies would be to make money on timber sales, but the money that they receive from timber sales in the Kirtland's warbler nesting areas of the northern Lower Peninsula is actually less than what it takes to replant those same acres that have just been harvested. Imagine putting a tree in the ground and having it lose value over 60 years. Based on habitat projections, we can expect the Kirtland's warbler population to take a nosedive over the next decade. The orange columns on the left are actual census numbers. Starting in 2013, it was decided to conduct the census every 2 years, and starting in 2015, it was decided the census would be conducted every 5 years. The 2020 census obviously was not held because of COVID, so that explains the gap between 2015 and 2021. The blue columns are the population projections based on modeling of available habitat. The yellow column that you see in 2023 is a population estimate based on some limited census work and spot checks of habitat conducted by the Forest Service and the DNR. The numbers were bleak, and they will continue to fall over the next decade until the amount of breeding habitat increases. And as you'll see also those two horizontal lines on the chart. The yellow line represents the 1976 conservation plan, that the goal for the species considered recovered at 1,000 acres, and the grayish line above that is the line that represents emergency relisting onto the Endangered Species Act. The trigger is 1,300 pairs. It's clear that we're going to fall well below that trigger. Whether the Fish and Wildlife Service is going to relist the bird is up in the air. If Fish and Wildlife is convinced that there's a plan in place that will bring the Kirtland's warbler population back above that 1,300 pair goal, they might just let it ride. Our credibility is on the line here, and we know it. The agencies know it. The conservation community is watching very, very carefully. Emergency relisting would be incredibly embarrassing for the DNR, for the Forest Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it would add a lot of ammunition to the foes of the Endangered Species Act, who have a fairly big platform and can make a lot of noise. The lesson here is simple. We can never afford to lose our focus on Kirtland's warbler conservation again, ever. So how do we move forward? Well, the agencies have reassessed where they stand, and they're adapting accordingly to meet the needs of the goals in the conservation plan. The vast majority of the on-the-ground conservation work is shared by the Forest Service and the Michigan DNR. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service owns some of the land in the area, but it tends to be in small, non-contiguous blocks. The three agencies have worked closely together over the years, but with this habitat hiccup, they realize they need to coordinate their efforts much, much more closely. And because of this problem, they're starting to monitor the habitat cycle more thoroughly, which will allow the agencies to catch problems at an earlier stage. Cross our fingers, we hope. Perhaps the most important step is increased use of good neighbor authority. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with that. It allows the Michigan DNR to do work on federal forest land. The real advantage of this is that the DNR can do this work much, much more cheaply than the Forest Service. The Forest Service, the DNR, and the Fish and Wildlife Service have developed a plan to get back to the 3,830 acres per year goal, plus an additional 10% over the next couple of decades to get us back to the 36,000 acres available. And much of that will be conducted through mastication. What you see on your screen there is a machine that will actually be chopping up the jack pines in the 20 to 30-year-old range that will be then allowed to sit on the land and regenerate naturally. That will create new Kirtland's warbler habitat. It seems to be the most cost-effective way of doing this, of playing catch up at this moment. But it's going to take a while. The Michigan DNR just got a grant to purchase a masticator. They're not going to be able to pull the trigger on this until October 1st, which means they won't have it until next spring. And so any work that would be done to play catch up is done for this season. And it's going to have to wait until 2025 to really get underway. One of the benefits of this work is that it's not just about the Kirtland's warbler. There are lots of other species in this habitat that will benefit from the mastication work and the habitat catch-up work that's being done. Wild turkey and snowshoe hare are going to get a big boost in numbers from increasing the area of young successional habitat. When the area habitat gets a little older and denser, white-tailed deer are going to love it. They're going to get a boost because during the winter in particular, it's 5 degrees warmer inside the dense jack pine than it is outside the dense jack pine. That has been one of the shifts that has actually occurred over the past few years. The conservation team has shifted away from single species conservation efforts to landscape scale thinking. The Kirtland's warbler may be the most well-known inhabitant of the jack pine outwash ecosystem in northern Michigan, but it's not the only one, of course. We're asking ourselves if the decisions that we make are having negative impacts or positive impacts on the ecosystem as a whole and the other species in it. That's a really big shift in the way we've been thinking, and it's a positive one. Here's a good reason of how we're thinking on the landscape scale. Over the past 10 years or so, the agencies have created a problem for themselves because they've tied up too much land in experimental plots. Experimental plots are really important to us right now because it has given us the opportunity to ask ourselves, well, can we do Kirtland's warbler conservation better? Can we find better ways to do this? Even before the Kirtland's warbler came off the endangered species list, the DNR and the Forest Service were beginning to rethink how they did jack pine management, with one eye on improving the quality of the jack pine when it goes to market. If they could create bigger, better quality trees, they would get more from the timber sale. So for the past 50 years or so, the standard was to plant 100 acres or so at a time, with jack pine at about 1,200 stems per acre. The planting was done in an opposing wave pattern that leaves openings so that every acre is about 75% dense jack pine and about 20% open. And what you see here in these smaller, greener patches are the open areas that I'm referring to. These are the areas that are interspersed. So the Forest Service is asking itself, well, what happens if we were to plant fewer open areas, but make those areas, open areas, larger? And so those browner areas that you're seeing in this stand called Ogama 49 is an overlay of what the new planting pattern might look like. It probably won't be planted at 1,200 acres anymore. It'll probably be planted at 900 stems per acre. It'll allow the trees to have a little bit more open area, less competition for resources, and hopefully it will allow those trees to grow a little bit larger, a little bit stronger, a little bit straighter. The problem with this plan is, of course, we won't know whether it's successful in bringing in additional money, a higher auction number when the tract goes up for sale in 60 years. It's an awful long time to wait to get an answer. Some of the tracts have been interspersed with red pine, which is a higher value species. Again, that is another problem that we have to wait 60 years to find out whether or not it's going to be successful in bringing in higher money at sums at the auction. But we already know that the male Kirtland's warblers see no difference in areas of red pine and jack pine. The areas that have been interspersed with red pine, it's still predominantly jack pine, but there's a little bit more red pines. The male Kirtland's warblers see no difference in that, and they're in there singing pretty well. The agencies have agreed to do a much better job of coordinating their efforts into the future. And before we can do any additional experimentation, because they've maxed out on experimentation acres, they need to figure out how to free up more land, because the agencies, as I said, they've maxed out. The first step is to assess what has worked and what has not. If the agencies determine a specific type of experimental treatment that meets habitat needs and can be considered acceptable treatment, that will allow us to shift those acres to the acceptable treatment and allow us to free up additional acres for more experimentation. One of the things we've been noticing over the past decade or so is that land that has been planted as Kirtland's warbler habitat through traditional treatments, harvesting, trenching, and planting, has had a loss of biodiversity. High quality jack pine outwash ecosystem habitat would include species such as Voss's goldenrod, wood lily, and Hill's thistle, and those species are disappearing from many of the jack pine plantations. With that being documented now, we're starting to understand the impact that artificial jack pine management is having on the ecosystem. We trench before we plant. So we go through and create these trenches in opposing wave pattern to mimic the randomness of fire. We do that trenching before we plant the trees directly into mineral soil in order to minimize the competition, give those little trees a head start, a boost. So they're not getting outcompeted by the other plants around them. But that trenching disturbs the roots of the existing plants that are already growing there. So what you've done in creating this trench is you've flipped over the soil and plants and you've deposited that on the plants next to the trench. As a quick aside, the DNR uses trenching. The Forest Service does a slightly different treatment. They do what's called scalping. They have a machine that goes in and just scalps the top level of the soil and turns that over every few feet or so in places where they're going to be planting trees. It is absolutely superior method to preparing the soil for planting of jack pines because it causes much, much less disturbance. We also know that treating 100 acres or so in a mosaic is fragmenting populations that would otherwise have been connected. The bottom line here is that in an effort to save one species, our management efforts are impacting others. So the question becomes, how do we manage for species like Hill's thistle, upland sandpiper, the dusted skipper, the Allegheny plum, and others before they disappear? What's the solution? Well, the best way to manage the ecosystem is to let the ecosystem be the ecosystem. And the best way to do that is through the use of fire. Everybody on the conservation team knows that this is the best answer to the problem. If the ecosystem can regenerate itself naturally, that is far less expensive than harvesting and replanting. It's better for the ecosystem since everything there is absolutely built to burn. And it would help ensure a much healthier ecosystem in the long run if we were to just allow the ecosystem to burn. Many of you as habitat stewards use fire today to maintain a few acres of prairie or maybe eliminate the buildup of duff and hardwoods. Jack pines are a totally different beast. I'm sure you know that from throwing a pine log on a fire, that pine log burns hot and fast. It's even worse in early spring. That's because the jack pine, before it comes out of dormancy, that sap has concentrated into a substance that is very, very similar to turpentine in its flammability. So there's a huge risk there. And we saw that. We saw that risk in the Mac Lake fire, which I referred to earlier. Fire in the jack pine is flat out dangerous. The Mac Lake fire is one of the most studied wildfires of all time. And a Forest Service report on the Mac Lake fire concluded that over the path of the fire, the almost 25,000 acres that burned, the fire consumed 270,000 tons of fuel, and it released 3 trillion BTUs of energy. Let's compare that. I mean, it's difficult to figure out what 3 trillion BTUs of energy is. Well, that would be comparable to the energy released in the Hiroshima atomic bomb dropped 9 times. Yeah, that's a lot of energy, and it's a pretty good reason to be super cautious about fire. So it doesn't take a genius to know that our wildfire suppression efforts has changed the frequency of fire in the ecosystem. Kirtland's warbler conservation plan acknowledges that in the 1880s, catastrophic landscape replacing fires burned every 60 years or so, and smaller fires burned about 14,000 acres per year. Today, we expect a stand replacing fire because we're squelching fire when it starts if it's not intentionally set. So a major stand replacing fire on the landscape is expected to occur once every 775 years, and smaller fires consume only about 1,040 acres of trees on average in a year. Thus, the need for artificial management. But what if we reintroduced fire? What have we learned since the Mac Lake fire, and how would things be different? Well, for starters, fire science is an entirely new field of study for biologists. I'll bet some of the people who are attending this webinar today already know about the Lake States Fire Science Consortium, which is based at some school in Ohio. Sorry for letting my bias show through. Through the work of the consortium and the Joint Fire Science Program at the Fish and Wildlife Service, we know much more about how fires behave than we did it in 1980. We also have much more accurate weather forecasts, which would give us a much better idea of when we should and should not ignite a prescribed burn. We've also shifted our thinking about the timing of when to set a prescribed burn in the jack pine. At one time, it was thought spring was the best time, just before the trees and ground plants emerge from dormancy. Now we're thinking that that's way too dangerous and that we should be conducting prescribed burns in this jack pine in the late summer or autumn, which according to the Michigan Natural Features Inventory is more likely in line with historical patterns. One more thing, and this is pertains to what you see in the image that you see on your screen right now. Both the Michigan DNR and the U.S. Forest Service have installed very large fuel breaks in their respective forests. We know that intense fires can jump fuel breaks, but the odds of that happening are much, much smaller when you take a combination of needle moisture and the expanded use of fire breaks into account. Fire in the jack pine ecosystem is being discussed in the hypothetical. I had this conversation yesterday with somebody from the Michigan DNR who said, yeah, we want to do it, but. So I think that it might actually happen sometime later this decade. If you spent any time in the areas around Mayo, you've seen these signs along the side of the county roads urging people to make sure there is sufficient space between the forest and their homes. It's a little bit creepy, these signs, but it's a really good reminder of how dangerous it is, the jack pine is, and how important it is to protect yourself from fire by having a large enough space between the forest and your home. The movement to bring back fire as a major tool of ecosystem management is being led by a new generation of researchers and biologists, and they're pushing pretty hard to ensure the ecosystem is managed as naturally as possible. The old timers on the conservation team aren't opposed to the use of fire. Oops, I'm running out of time. I better finish this up. They want to make sure that the ecosystem is managed as effectively as possible, but they really fear fire. They remember what happened with the Mac Lake fire, and they shudder, absolutely shudder, when they talk about fire on a large scale. Fire would be a much more practical solution if the area was nothing but miles of wilderness, but scattered throughout the KW habitat is oil wells and houses and natural gas pipelines, both above and below ground. And then there are the private residences. It is just too many people, too many houses, too many things there that would allow us to really set fire along the landscape. So I'm going to skip a little bit ahead and just say we're very excited about tribal involvement. The conservation is working hard to increase tribal involvement in the jack pine management in Michigan. Last month, the Forest Service shared plans with a new jack pine ecosystem landscape with the on the Hiawatha National Forest in the UP that takes tribal concerns into account. Our tribal partners emphasize that the Kirtland's warblers are important to them, but their perspective is that the Kirtland's warbler is equal in importance to all the other plants and animals that are associated with this ecosystem. So it's no more important to them than it is than any other species. They stress the importance of managing the jack pine to support all the beings that coexist, all the plants and animals within the jack pine landscape, providing for early successional habitat, improving conditions for traditional foods and medicines, and returning healthy fire to the landscape. These tribal priorities are being incorporated into the proposed action in the Hiawatha. I'm personally thrilled by this, and I can't wait to add it. We sometimes pursue fact in almost a reptilian way, cold-blooded reptilian way. I'm very excited that we can bring Native American tribal wisdom to bear on this. Very quickly, what about the cowbird? Cowbird populations have dropped significantly over the past couple of decades. We are no longer trapping cowbirds on the landscape, but we've seen an uptick in cowbird population in the last couple of years. We are monitoring very, very closely to see if the cowbird population is going to reach a point where we're going to have to re-begin trapping again. The 2025 census is going to be held. We are looking for volunteers. We need experienced birders. We don't need somebody out there in the field who doesn't know what a Kirtland's warbler looks and sounds like. We need people to be in good physical condition because you were actually swimming through, 15-year-old trees on rough ground, branches. It's really difficult. We're asking for a multi-day commitment. We don't want to train you, spend the money on training you, and then have you walk away after seeing the birds. We're asking for a multi-day commitment. We will train you on a very specific protocol that must be followed. If you're interested, contact me at director@kirtlandswarbler.org. And I know I didn't leave a whole lot of time for questions. I apologize for that. Thank you for your time.
Bill, thank you so much. Really, really excellent, and great to learn more about the work that you all are doing. In the closing minutes, one quick other than volunteering with the survey and monitoring in 2025, tell us a little bit more about the Kirtland's Warbler Initiative and other ways that we can support the work that you all do.
Mostly it's through the census and monitoring. If you are interested in coming up to Lansing to talk to state legislators, please let me know. We'd love to have you come up and talk to the folks in Lansing about why this is important, why Kirtland's Warbler conservation still matters. And it's not just Kirtland's warbler, of course, it's all the other species that live in it, including all the game species. We are equally as concerned about them as we are the Kirtland's warbler these days. And yeah, that's pretty much it. All the on the ground conservation work is being conducted by the federal government and the state government. So we don't do all that much, but the first Saturday of May of next year is Jack Pine Planting Day. We will be planting probably 5 acres. Volunteers will be planting that day. Would love to have you come up for Jack Pine Planting Day. It's always the first Saturday of May. If you're interested, drop a line, director@kirtlandswarbler.org. I will put you on a mailing list. You probably won't hear anything from us until early in 2025. But yes, we'd love to have you join us. It is a day where you can connect with the landscape and do something for the Kirtlands. Imagine the satisfaction of coming back in 5 or 6 years when the trees are old enough to host the Kirtland's warbler and looking at that landscape and saying, I planted those trees and there's a Kirtland's warbler singing right there.
That's great, and great opportunity to make a difference. So Bill, thank you so much. And thank you all to you all who have been here for this hour-long presentation. Bill, really appreciate, as folks are dropping in the chat, really great presentation. Looking forward to staying abreast of the work that you all are doing and appreciating all that goes into these conservation-dependent species and learning more about that over the last hour. So again, I want to thank you so much for being here today with us, Bill. As folks are dropping into the chat, really appreciate it. I want to give you all a little update on the Stewardship Network. As you all know, as I said, let me just see. Let me. There we go. Okay. I went away from my screen for a minute. Sorry about that. Encourage you all to become a regular. As I said, the second Wednesday of each and every month. We'll send a reminder email. Encourage you to go and sign up for those. In October, we'll be talking about volunteer stewardship tips and tricks from a super volunteer with Emily and Wayne from the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. In November, we'll be talking about urban forest stewardship and empowering communities with Asia Downton from Michigan State University. Really pleased to have Asia back. And then in December, we'll be talking about jumping worms in Michigan, impacts ID, and prevention with Scott from Oakland University. Encourage you all to go sign up now. As we said, we'll send you reminders. You can go to stewardshipnetwork.org/webcasts. And again, thank you so much for your time, Bill. Thank you so much for your time, all of you online. Really wonderful to be with you. Looking forward to being with you again next month on the second Wednesday. Encourage you all to take a moment, think about what you want to present about the important stewardship work that you're doing. We'd love to have you at our conference, and a reminder that the deadline is October 1st.